Say you want a revolution.
Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lewis. The mission of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics is to enhance your physical and emotional well-being and encourage community. I say encourage community because I believe that human beings live most effectively and in the most healthy ways when we live in community. Community means we know everyone around us by name or at least by face. When we do that, we human beings tend to be cooperative, collaborative animals. We like doing things together. We like inventing things together. We like playing together, whether it's a sewing circle or a poker game or watching a game on television or throwing around something or eating together. We just love eating together in circles. We're tribal animals, and we have been throughout all of our existence. We like being together. At the very same time, we must also be aware that there's a very small percentage of us that are very different. This group of humans are predators and dominators. This group would prefer to have subjects than citizens. Going way back to times in Egypt that's recorded when the pharaohs ruled 99% of the population, you can move forward at various times in history, perhaps when Caesar crossed the Rubicon and changed the Roman Empire, which he didn't change the Roman Empire, he changed the Roman Republic, which was an early experiment with democracy and republic. Remember, the Greeks had the first one, a brief experiment with democracy and republic. Then the Romans, again, and then Caesar changed it into an empire. And from then on, the world was pretty much ruled by what I call gangsters. They called themselves kings. They were the people who came out of the caves with the biggest clubs, eventually ruled the little villages and then the towns, and then they put a perimeter around their territory eventually and called it a country. Remember, countries are made up of boundaries made up by man. When you go out in space and look down at the Earth, you don't see countries. You see one planet, which is what we are. But these dominator predators carve out space which they want to rule. And then what happened? A few hundred years ago, we overturned that system. We rebelled against a king named George, and we rebelled against the church because the kings had made a deal with the churches, remember, to rule by what was called divine right. So if you went against the king, you went against the church, you had your head chopped off, and the church was behind it. We rebelled against that, and we did a creation, which is our present experiment with democracy and republic. But remember, folks, it's an experiment, and it's a fragile one, and we must do what we can to maintain it, because there are those, as I said, whether it's Caesar, you can go to Napoleon, you can jump into the 20th century with Hitler and Mussolini, you can come into the 21st century with people like Bolsonaro and Putin and Trump. These are all people who would rule and have subjects. We must defend our democracy and our republic, and that means we've got to get out and vote to protect what we have. In the words of one of my favorite heroes, Thomas Jefferson, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Right now in our country, we're going through what some people consider to be a perfect storm of challenges. We have the pandemic that we just came through, the pandemic where we took tribal animals, isolated ourselves, created alienation, and we now have what some consider an epidemic of anxiety and depression. We're going to hear about that from our guest today. We also have climate change, which is going on. We have major economic stratification, where 70% of our country right now are living paycheck to paycheck. These all are not sustainable. These are things we must do something about. Our guest today, Dr. Amy McGuire, is working on doing something about it. Dr. Amy McGuire is the Leon Jaworski Professor of Biomedical Ethics and director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor University in Texas. Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, Amy.
Thank you.
What's on your radar screen nowadays, Amy, in your work, your professional work? What's first and foremost?
Well, I mean, as usual, there are a lot of, the work that we do at Baylor College of Medicine is really focused on ethical issues in today's changing world and in our changing environment in biomedicine and biomedical research. There's a lot that's at the frontier of how we think about health and how we treat illness. And so you mentioned one of the things that's really been front of mind for me for several years, which is the mental health epidemic that we're currently in. And it's partly, I think, in response to some of the things that you talked about with regard to social isolation during the pandemic. But I think there's other sort of factors that are feeding into why so many people in our society are suffering, and how they're suffering, and what we might be able to do to try to relieve some of that suffering.
Am I accurate when I'm stating that we have what could be considered an epidemic of mental health issues with regard to anxiety and depression?
Well, we've certainly seen a tremendous increase in the prevalence of anxiety and depression population-wide. Prior to the pandemic, I think the numbers were at about 11% of the population reporting symptoms or clinically significant symptoms of anxiety or depression. And throughout the pandemic, that number rose to about 40%. In some surveys, it was even greater than 40%. So, and then, of course, there was a really well-publicized, really pithy and fantastic article that Adam Grant wrote in the New York Times that talked about those in society who aren't actually suffering from clinical symptoms of anxiety or depression, but are still suffering from some sense of just indifference, or as he calls it, meh, kind of like things are just meh. And why there's a lack of motivation and enthusiasm in our lives today.
Meh. It's an interesting word. It sounds to me like sort of a modern variation, and check me out on this, of what the French existentialists called ennui. They called it the sickness unto death. It was a kind of existential boredom, which is very dangerous because it's sort of like one step just this side of depression.
Yeah. Yeah, so it may not be caught in clinical evaluations for people who meet the clinical criteria for a mental health disorder like depression or anxiety, but it's still not healthy. And we still want to try to address sort of what's going on there, right?
Well, the number that you just put out is dramatic, Amy, that we went from 11% of the population manifesting symptoms to 40%. I don't, is 40% of the population manifesting mental health symptoms sustainable for a culture?
So, I mean, it's certainly not healthy for culture, and it's definitely not healthy for individuals. And, we'll have to kind of see. I think there's been a lot of effort over the last couple of years to try to address what's going on. And we're going to need to continue to do that. And it has to be done both at the individual level and also at the sort of public health level, because when you have numbers like that, you're really dealing with a public health situation and not just an individual situation. So we need to be addressing sort of like, what can we do to help individuals, but how can we also change our systems? How can we change our culture in ways that promotes healthier living and better mental health across the population?
From your exalted position, can you see evidence of changes either starting or being put into practice on either a local, statewide, or national level? Is there anything happening, Amy?
So I think there's certainly more attention being paid. I think the Surgeon General has done a really fantastic job of calling attention to sort of the mental health crisis that's going on and calling for interventions to help. There's been a lot more effort to make mental health services more broadly available through telemedicine and other technological advances that I think we should see some benefit from that. And I think there's kind of a social movement to try to acknowledge some of the deep-seated roots behind what is causing suffering among different populations. So we've seen that with regard to really shining a light in a new way on issues around structural racism and things like that. And then we've also seen resurgence of interest in use of novel therapeutics, and they're not so novel. These are therapeutics that have that date back to millennia of psychedelics, and that's been an area that we've looked a lot into. There's a tremendous amount of work being done now looking at how can we go back to plant medicine and develop drugs that have psychedelic properties that might help address some of our severe mental health challenges, as well as some of this existential angst that we're seeing in society today.
Are you implying that people at high levels of government, be they statewide or national, are actually considering the possibility of using psychedelic medicines as treatment for this, what we're calling an epidemic of mental illness?
Yeah, so there's been quite a bit of research that has gone on over the last decade or so, looking at the therapeutic potential for both focused primarily on MDMA and psilocybin, which is the compound that's in magic mushrooms, to treat various mental health conditions. In fact, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, declared that both MDMA and psilocybin breakthrough therapies for mental health disorders. For MDMA, it's for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's been some really fascinating studies showing its effects in post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly among veterans and other populations that have high prevalence of PTSD. And for psilocybin, it's been used in some studies very successfully to treat severe depression. And so it was named a breakthrough therapy for severe depression several years ago by FDA. Lots of states are starting to weigh in on this. We've seen decriminalization policies emerge in both Oregon and Colorado, as well as in some local jurisdictions. There's a lot of discussion and anticipation that the FDA is going to probably approve the first psychedelic medicines within the next year or two. And so a lot of people are starting to think about how we prepare for that within society.
So you see that there's actually some hope on the horizon for these novel medicines. I mean, I know that Rick Doblin has been attempting to get MDMA approved by the FDA for the last 37 years and still hasn't gotten the ball across the goal post. And each year that I talk to him, he says to me, it's next year and it's next year and it's next year. Rick and I have been friends for many decades, and he stayed with me recently at my home when he was out here in California and told me that the MAP, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Science, is within $80 million of getting FDA approval. So it's a little confusing to me to hear, on the one hand, that FDA has named MDMA and psilocybin as being breakthroughs, yet at the same time, they seem to be withholding or stalling actually giving FDA approval so that the medicine can be used as a medicine. What do you make of that?
Well, the FDA process is not a quick one. I think that MAPS that shouldn't come as a surprise, but I think MAPS is probably closer than it has been ever in its pursuit to get FDA approval. I think the bipartisan support is there. I think the enthusiasm is there, and the research is getting there. But FDA needs a body of evidence that's that can support the safe and effective implementation of drug products. And so far, the studies have been very promising, but we're still a little bit in early days. And so there's a big question of sort of when do you approve a product for general consumption? How good does the evidence have to be prior to going to market? And then what mechanisms are put into place to make sure that the products are safe and can be used safely and effectively post-market. And so I think that's sort of the political struggle right now, is figuring out when will the evidence achieve the threshold of approval, and then what kind of data do we need to be collecting post-approval to make sure that it's working in the ways that we think it ought to be working.
Well, it's 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 both encouraging and discouraging to me at the same time because I'm aware of the research, and the research has been going on for a very long time. The research on post-traumatic stress disorder with MDMA is very convincing. I don't know what more they need to see at this point, and what I don't know what the forces are that are keeping the approval from coming through, and that's on MDMA. Yet, when we had a pandemic with COVID, we sure got some vaccines through for federal approval very quickly. And so, given that it's taken 37 years and we still don't have MDMA through on approval, it makes me wonder how seriously the government is taking the mental health crisis that you and I are talking about. I mean,
Yeah, I'm not sure.
excuse me. I mean, I'm really excited to hear that you can say that the Surgeon General of the United States is aware of the seriousness of the mental health problem. That's exciting to me that he's or she is actually, is it a male or a female?
He.
He. It's exciting to me that he's even aware of it and acknowledges it, because you don't hear this on the news. I mean, there are certain things to me that seem to be so hidden that it's bothersome. I'm going to give you another example of this. From my perspective, one of the most serious symptoms that the United States is facing and has been facing is the obesity overweight epidemic. In the 20 years I've been broadcasting this program, we have gone from 58% of the population being obese or overweight to now over 70% of the population. Some of my colleagues are predicting that in less than 10 years, 87% of the population will be obese or overweight at the present rate of increase. You're a psychologist. So am I. We look.
No, I'm not a
Oh, I
psychologist, just
thought
to
your,
put that.
excuse me, I thought your PhD was in psychology.
No, it's in medical ethics and health
I
humanities.
beg your
Yeah.
pardon. Okay. I'm a psychologist. When I see 72% of the population manifesting one symptom, one of the things I say to myself is, what is this culture telling us as a culture when 72% of the of us are expressing a deleterious symptom, a symptom that we all know who study any of this is connected to cardiovascular problems, connected to diabetes, maybe connected to cancer. There's no direct relationship between obesity, overweight, and cardiovascular and diabetes. There's no question about that. So I say, what I say to myself and my friends, what are we saying? What are we saying? You're telling us now that we've gone from 11% to 40% with regard to anxiety and depression symptoms, and I'm adding to this overweight obesity epidemic. Is this not very serious?
So I think it's serious, and I don't think we should take sort of the government process and the slowness in the government process to mean that people don't care about the problem. I think that would be an overreach in interpreting sort of what's going on. There's good reason that sort of approval processes for new drugs takes time. And the FDA has been criticized for taking way too much time in certain circumstances. So it's very challenging to try to strike the right balance where you're making sure that what goes to market to consumers and to patients is safe and it's potentially effective for the indications that it's marketed for, while at the same time making sure that you can expeditiously review the data that's being generated to make those decisions so that you're not withholding potentially beneficial treatments from patients who really, really need it. And that's a difficult balance to strike. And I'm not going to argue that the FDA always gets it right. They certainly don't. But I do think it's very complicated, and it's not an easy they're doing it right or they're doing it wrong kind of solution, I think.
Do you know the FDA people well enough to say that their board is not overloaded with pharmaceutical company present and former executives who have a vested interest in stalling off psychedelics? Because, for example, Roland Griffith's study at Johns Hopkins indicated that with 1 or 2 sessions of psilocybin, there was a relief from depression a year later, which is just the opposite of what the pharmaceutical companies are doing when they're selling SSRIs that have to be taken every single day. Because if these novel medicines go through, the pharmaceutical companies could lose their annuities.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know the FDA well enough to be able to comment on that and what interests are at stake here.
Uh-huh.
I do think that the one point that you're bringing up that's an important point to keep in mind is that, as in all products, including drug products, it's big business. And there are commercial interests. I mean, it was estimated that in the next 4 or 5 years, the psychedelic industry is going to be a $10 billion industry. So people are going to be making money in some capacity. And whenever there's money involved, there's always interests and potentially competing interests that can drive policy and that can drive action. And so it's very important to kind of think about what those interests are and make sure that, that we're doing the best science and that we're understanding the properties of these compounds and how they work and for whom they work and when they work, and making sure that they become available to the people who need them in ways that are beneficial to them and provide efficacious treatment without providing too much, without causing too much risk or harm.
Do the products that are being sold mostly to people of lower socioeconomic brackets, which are what some of us consider to be relatively empty calories, which put on weight without really great benefit to the energy system? Is the sale of those products, does that come within your wheelhouse of medical ethics?
So that is not a topic that I have worked on personally. So, depending on the issue that you're talking about, it might fall within the field of bioethics or medical ethics, but it's not a topic that I've worked on
And
personally.
okay, but the topic of how to use or misuse psychedelics is within your area of expertise.
So we do have a program at Baylor College of Medicine that's looking at ethical and policy implications of the use of psychedelics in society and its integration into the healthcare system, as well as its use outside of the healthcare system. So yes.
Is your group or the group at Baylor, are you working on guidelines to ensure safe and effective psychedelics? Is that part of what they do or you do?
That's part of what we're trying to do. There's a lot of groups out there that are trying to develop guidelines, but we've recently helped organize a meeting where we had multidisciplinary people who are involved in this space kind of come together and think through what is the landscape going to look like post FDA approval, and what might be some guidelines that we need to be thinking about with regard to the integration of these drug products into Western medical practice, recognizing that there are other circumstances under which they might be used both for medicinal and non-medicinal purposes.
And is it also within your sphere of research and work, creating guidelines for adherence to policies regarding the use of these medicines?
What do you mean by
Well, in other
guidelines?
words, you can put a policy into place, but then you need some way of enforcing the policy and
Sure.
or
So
something out to the public. For example, with psilocybin in a way, in terms of getting it individually, has a similarity to alcohol in that alcohol is relatively easy to make, although there aren't many people making it at home anymore because it's easy to purchase. The same thing is true with psilocybin. It's very easy to grow the mushrooms in one's home. So people really they don't really have to go to a pharmacy or a store if it's made legal in order to purchase it. They could grow their own. Whereas that's very different with something like LSD or MDMA, which is much more complicated for the most people to make. You need a chemist to make those things. So once you need a chemist, I can see how you could create guidelines for what the substance is, guidelines for how they're sold, and how they're regulated. I'm wondering how that's done when you have something like magic mushrooms, which like marijuana, you can grow in your backyard. It's another example for that, and many
Yeah.
people do, and that's part of what happened with marijuana in this country, as it's been illegal for so long, is that there were people growing their own, and of course the black market people are growing their own and selling it.
Right. So it is possible, and there is sort of precedent for like government agencies like the FDA to regulate botanicals, naturally occurring substances. It's much more difficult for many of the reasons that you point out. One is that it's more difficult to ensure sort of a centralized distribution program, like where are you getting it from? And as well as, naturally grown mushrooms, for example, they have many, many different compounds that are present in them, and you don't know how much of each compound is in each single mushroom. And so it's very difficult to ensure consistency and know exactly what you're getting when you're treating a patient. And so it becomes more difficult to regulate that. And when we talk about sort of, ensuring adherence to policies and guidelines, there's many different policies that can, at different levels, right? So there may be federal laws that are in place that have its own system of adherence, right? If you break a federal law, there could be civil or criminal penalties associated with that. There are state laws. There's policies at the level of state licensure boards for physicians and what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do and who's qualified to be a physician and those sorts of things. So there's different levels of policy, and how you ensure adherence to different policies will depend on kind of the level that you're at and what the policy is.
Yeah, because see, part of my thinking is that using marijuana, for example, I don't recall, and you maybe know a lot more, hopefully, on this. I don't recall ever seeing what I call honest information from the government on how to use marijuana. Because it's been illegal, it's almost like that kind of information one has to get from either word of mouth, or now that we have the internet, what people put on the internet. But there are no,
Yeah.
there are no guidelines. There's no harm reduction policy where the government would come out and say, okay, marijuana is illegal, but we know a lot of you are using it. So here we're going to tell you, if you're using it, even though we don't condone it, here are some guidelines to how you don't get in trouble. For example, and if you smoke this much, it's hard to tell what's in it. You don't know what the consistency is, and, sort of warnings like that. And I'll give you a good example of this. Someone I know bought some marijuana brownies. Well, when you smoke a marijuana cigarette and you take a puff, you can have a reaction very quickly, because it's a administration right into the capillaries in the mouth. The buccal system goes right in. It's very quick, and you feel it. So you can sort of self-regulate as to when to stop. For many people, at least, you don't keep smoking 10 times if you have enough of a reaction in 1 or 2 times. But that isn't the case with edibles. So what happened with this person I know is they weren't aware of how much to eat, and they ate the whole cookie. Well, they went into cosmic hyperspace. Now, if you're in your home and you go into the cosmic hyperspace, I mean, nobody dies from marijuana. It's not lethal. But if you do it in your home, okay, you can lay down in bed, you can sit in a chair, and you can sort of wait it out. This happened to the person in an automobile. And when I heard about it, I thought, I wonder how many people around the country have had that happen in automobiles, because they weren't aware of the fact that when you eat it, you can't titrate in the same way. You don't know how much you had. And then all of a sudden, you see what I'm getting at. 45 minutes later, they got hit, and with a massive dose. Those are the kind of guidelines I'm sort of, asking about, how they, how we could possibly create or look forward to in order to protect the public, and sort of acknowledge the fact that people are going to use these things, whether they're legal or not, And how can we protect?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are obviously some basic safety parameters of, whenever you're taking a mind altering substance, you shouldn't be in an automobile or drive, or at least I hope he wasn't driving, but,
No,
but you should be driving an
fortunately not
automobile.
driving. Right.
Hey everybody, it's Tommy D, the nonprofit sector connector, coming at you from my attic. Each week here on talkradio.nyc, I host the program Philanthropy in Focus. Nonprofits impact us each and every day, and it's my focus to help them amplify their message and tell their story. Listen each week at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on talkradio.nyc.
Were you an essential worker during the pandemic? If you needed to learn stages of epilepsy, did you depend on advocates? Did you use new innovations to cope with mental and neurological issues? Maintaining high quality of life and keeping good mental health are what we all strive for. I'm Frank R. Harrison, host of Frank About Health, and each week top healthcare influencers, professionals, and innovators answer these questions and more. Stay tuned on Thursdays at 5 p.m. on talkradio.nyc, and I will continue to be frank about health with all of you.
Are you a business owner? Do you want to be a business owner? Do you work with business owners? Hi, I'm Stephen Fry, your small and medium-sized business or SMB guy, and I'm the host of the new show, Always Friday. While I love to have fun on my show, we take those Friday feelings of freedom and clarity to discuss popular topics on the minds of SMBs today. Please join me and my various special guests on Friday at 11 a.m. on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Okay, good. So, there's sort of a double-edged sword here that I think you're getting at, which is that, and I think cannabis is a great example to look at this. So, when there's some evidence that suggests that there could be some therapeutic benefit with the use of a substance like cannabis, one impulse is to say, well, let's make it as broadly available. Let's decriminalize it. Let's make it legal. Let's give people access to it because there's a lot of people out there suffering. And if it can help people, they should be able to use it and they should have access to it. One of the challenges with that is that when you have very, very broad access, as we've seen with cannabis, where in many of the states now it's been decriminalized and you can get access to it through your local dispensary, we have less incentive for individuals to participate in sort of like randomized clinical trials, to really understand the science behind it, to understand how much marijuana do you need to treat this particular condition under these circumstances, where how should you be taking it? Is it better to eat it or smoke it? Is it better to, what are the details of what we need to know about how to treat a patient who has a medical diagnosis with that particular substance? And the best way to know how to do that is to do randomized controlled trials where you put people on, that you give them a placebo, you give them the test, or you give them, something else, and you compare the effects and you compare sort of the outcomes. There's less incentive for people. If I'm suffering significantly from, let's say, I'm going through chemotherapy treatments and I'm very, very ill from it, and I've heard smoking marijuana can make me feel better. Am I going to enter a randomized clinical trial where there's a 50% chance that I'm not going to get the cannabis that may make me feel better? Or am I going to go to my local dispensary and just try it and see if it works for me and do some self-experimentation? Most people are going to do the latter. And what that does is it prevents us from having sort of the really strong evidence that's necessary to be able to put out that information, to be able to say, when you're suffering from this particular condition under these circumstances, this is exactly what you need to take, how much of it, and what's going to benefit you the most. And so that was my comment about needing more data for psychedelics, is to really understand before FDA approval, right? And it becomes really widely available, or before state decriminalization, where we go down the same path that we went down with cannabis, is to really understand what is the science, what is, how does this work for whom, under what circumstances, when administered, how. Like in psychedelics, there's a lot of debate and discussion about how psychedelics work. And many people believe that it's really just an adjunct to intensive psychotherapy, that it primes people to be more vulnerable and open to the psychotherapeutic process. But there hasn't been a ton of research that has suggested, what does that process need to look like? And is that true? If you take if you don't have that process in place, can you still have the same effect? And, even if you do have that process in place, how many sessions are needed? What kind of psychotherapy is most effective during those sessions? And we have theories about that. And we have some best practices that have emerged from the field. But maybe additional research to try to understand that better. And it might be different for different mental health conditions, right? So somebody with, OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder may respond differently to different therapeutic regimens than somebody with severe or intractable depression. So I think that's where I think we need to kind of continue to build our evidence base so that we can most effectively educate both clinicians and potential patients or consumers about not only what's safe, but what's going to be optimally effective for them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the buzz that I hear around the country from people in the psychedelic world shares that view more and more, that the psychotherapy that follows the event is the critical variable, that these things are not a one-time panacea where you take them and you're cured. In fact, I've taken now to liken it to the psychedelic experience is like having someone open up your inner gold mine, and the therapy that you do afterwards is taking each of the nuggets that you found in that mine and polishing them and evolving with them and then practicing with them. But if you don't do the polishing and the practice, you had a one-time experience. It might be a great experience, but it's not necessarily going to create the kind of behavior change that you want in order to improve your mental health or whatever it was, some issues that you went in with. Of course, there's a whole nother area having to do with psychedelics that doesn't get talked about yet, because we're focusing on you and I and the country really is focusing on the medical applications of these medicines. And that the area that's not yet being really focused on, that I think will take a long time, but will come, is how these medicines affect creativity and ingenuity, because
So we've started to see some buzz about that and discussion about that. I saw an article, I think it was in The Economist, or one of maybe I'm wrong about that, but one of the news articles that came out that was talking about, Silicon Valley businesses having psychedelic retreats for their employees in order to stimulate creativity. And so I think there's been, that raises a whole bunch of issues around employment law and sort of what we're thinking, how we think about integrating this into business practices and things like that. But I do think it kind of hints at what you're talking about, which other people are thinking about additional uses of psychedelics beyond sort of the therapeutic potentials. And that kind of moves us into the realm of, is this some sort of enhancement? Are people going to be at a disadvantage if they, for medical reasons or for their own personal preferences, decide not to use psychedelics? Are they going to be sort of disadvantaged in business? Are they going to be viewed as being less creative? Are they going to, in fact, be less creative? Or less productive? So I think it raises a whole lot of issues in how we think about the use of psychedelics, not just therapeutically, but potentially for certain types of enhancement.
That's a point really well taken, Amy, because I'm thinking as you're talking that we don't allow certain enhancement drugs to be used in athletics, right? If an Olympic champion is caught doping their blood with certain kinds of substances, they're eliminated. Now we're talking about people in business, people in the tech world, doping their neurotransmitters, and they're going to get a leg up. I'm thinking about how the great tennis player Navratilova got a tremendous leg up when she was one of the first, if not the first, to travel with a nutritionist and a psychologist. And what she got from those two consultants was a tremendous leg up. And it's well known in Silicon Valley, whether it's known around the country or not, but it's known in Silicon Valley that Watson and Crick used psychedelics when they discovered the DNA model, that Carl Sagan used psychedelics in his astrophysics work, that Steve Jobs used psychedelics in his work with Apple. And when people like that, come out and talk about the fact that they think that these psychedelics help them make these great discoveries, it has an impact. There's no question.
Yeah, there was a recent article that was talking about Sergey Brin and Elon Musk both using psychedelics. And so similar, discussion of very successful business people coming out and saying, yes, I've used psychedelics and I use it and it helps me in my business. And, this is not an entirely new conversation. We've had this conversation around the use of like ADHD, stimulant medications that people might take off label or, that aren't prescribed for them in order to gain focus and things like that and get a leg up. So it's part of a larger conversation around what we deem appropriate as a society. Where do you draw the line between doping in sports and having a nutritionist and a psychologist? I mean, it's a great example because that there is I think most of us can agree that, one's okay, the other's not, but like, where exactly is that line where we start to get uncomfortable, right?
Right. I just saw this movie about Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he talks very openly about the fact that all the bodybuilders were using steroids, and he even talked about what the protocol was, right?
Yeah, I just saw that too. Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. I want to move on to another topic, and it's a very personal one in your life, which when I heard about really touched me quite deeply. And that's the story about your son and his friends, and about how it's your story about how your son and his friends told you that they knew of 9 deaths of, I think I got the number right, of 9 deaths of people in their late teens or early 20s who died from suicide or what other, and you talk about, and I want you to talk about now what you see as the societal implications of your making that discovery in your own family.
Yeah, thank you for that. So this was a story I actually told a couple of years ago, and I'm sad to say the number's now 10 because we had another friend pass away recently. I was really amazed at this. I have 3 boys that I'm raising.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So they're now 22, 20, and 17. So this was a couple of years ago when I think they were 20, 18, and let's say 15. I was just, I had been visiting my 20-year-old at college. I was moving him back in after the summer, and we were with 2 of his friends, and we were talking about a good friend of theirs who had very recently at their college passed away unintentionally. He had been taking Xanax, drinking alcohol, had a bad mix, and overdosed. And it was really, really upsetting to them. And they were kind of talking about it, and we were sort of processing it over dinner. And what really struck me is that they did not seem terribly surprised about the fact that this had happened. I was very surprised that it had happened. And they were just sort of like, oh, this is horrible. Again, I can't believe this is, that this happened to him. And I started to ask them, I said, are you not surprised because you thought that this person had trouble, or you thought that this might happen? And they said, no, not at all. Like, I actually didn't anticipate that this would happen with this person. They're like, but this has happened with a lot of people we know. Like, this is not an uncommon occurrence. So I asked them, I said, how many people between the 3 of you do you know that have either died from suicide or from a drug overdose or some sort of, accidental death that was brought on by drugs or alcohol? And between the 3 of them, they came up with 9 friends. And I just remember thinking, like, I can't imagine knowing 9 people at the age of 20 who had died. Like, that was just insane to me. So what really, I feel really fortunate that we were able to have like a really meaningful conversation about this, because I kind of probed them and I said, they were really insightful as 20-year-olds. I said, what do you think's going on here? Like, this is crazy to me. And you don't seem to think it's crazy because I think it's just sort of what you grew up with, but what do you think is going on here? And as the more we spoke about it, the more I really kind of got to the point where I realized that for a lot of young people, there's just this sense of a lack of meaning in their life, right? That they're looking to, and suicide is one thing, but drugs and alcohol is also something that it's like an escape. They're looking for something to kind of numb either the pain, or they're looking for something to sort of self-treat the anxiety, or they're looking for something to sort of like give them some sense of meaning or something like that's not in existence. And so that really kind of stimulated me to start thinking about this mental health crisis that we're currently in, and what can we be doing sort of more broadly to address this? How can we be teaching our kids and ourselves and those in our lives how to just slow down for a second and like remember that, life is about connection. Life is about having meaningful connection, right? Having like that opportunity to be fully present and to really feel like you are seen by others, that you're connecting with others, that you're connecting with yourself, that you're living on a planet that's living and breathing, and you have connection to all the things on the planet. And I think that same sentiment is something that a lot of people who are proponents of the use of psychedelics talk about when they talk about psychedelic experiences, is this, trying to chase that or to have that experience of connection, of oneness, of, that some people describe as being sort of transcendent or, something like that. But I don't think you need psychedelics to have that experience. I think it's one tool that can create that experience for people. But there are other ways to create that experience. And we need to be doing a better job, I think, of instilling the value of connection in our children, and in ourselves.
Well, the issue, coming back to the psychedelic, is that yes, psychedelics do provide or can provide a remarkably transcendent experience. They can provide a sense of oneness with it all. I've experienced it myself many times. There's no question about that. But then you have to deal with day to day, and how do you create that meaning on a day to day basis? You can't keep taking the psychedelics every single day, otherwise you're signing on for what the big pharma is selling you, which is a daily annuity with a drug. But this story that you tell is an important story, and that's why I came back to it after I heard your story, Amy, because these boys are boys of privilege. They're going to
Absolutely.
they're going to college. That's a privilege in and of itself. And they know now 10 people who have gone down this way. That means that they're speaking for boys and girls all over the country of privilege. I don't think this is a one-off just because in this one particular, unless this one college, has the monopoly on this kind of behavior. I doubt it. We know that's not true.
No.
So,
No.
no, we have a national issue here, and that you're relating it to alienation in some way, to lack of connection, to lack of meaning, the things we talked about in the early part of our conversation today. I'm also relating it to the people in some way who are stuffing themselves with food as a way to fill some vacuum inside themselves, because that has to be at the core of it. It isn't just because they're being, sold cheap food. It's also because they're overeating it as a way of filling a hole. And I come back to the question of, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
What are we going to do
So
about it, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if I can answer that, but let me a couple of things you said that really struck me. So one is, absolutely, these were kids who come from tremendous privilege, right? They grew up in middle to upper class communities. They're going to college, they're well educated, they were white boys. It's just so much that was in their favor, and their friend groups as well. They have, so I do think that the issue is probably much, 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 much just worse for that if this is happening to them, it's happening it's happening at a much more serious level to people who don't have access to those things. The other thing I'll say is, I think as a parent of privilege, I can say that I have a friend who, and I just thought of this, I hadn't thought of this before, but I have a friend who had a child my child's age, but it was her second marriage, so she had a couple of older stepchildren. And about 5 years before my kids became teenagers and entered this phase, I remember her telling me about her kids, her stepchildren. And she was telling me something very similar about how many of their friends were drug addicts, had died, had done these things. And I remember thinking, I wonder who her kids are hanging out with. That's not me. That's never going to be my kids. And I remember we were sitting at a little league game because my son was like probably 11 at the time. And I was looking at the kids that were playing little league with him. And I was like, I can't imagine any of these kids that being an issue for them. Not me. That will never be me. And thinking back, it's like, I think we're all in such denial about this, right? Because it was some of those kids who were on the Little League field who I'm talking about, right? I mean, nobody escapes it. And it's not because you have bad kids. It's not because you grew up in a bad neighborhood. It's not because, it's just because, right? It's because it's hard to be a teenager these days. And there's a lot of temptation, and there's a lot of angst, and there's a lot of depression and anxiety, and people are just trying to figure out how to get through. And oftentimes they turn to the wrong things. So I think that was another point that kind of occurred to me as you were talking. And then I think the last thing is, you were talking about psychedelics may, not always, but may be able to create that sense of connection, that feeling of connection. And how do you sustain that? And this, I think, really ties back to our discussion about the therapeutic use of psychedelics being really integrated into a therapeutic context and really trying to use it in a way to understand what's happening from a psychotherapeutic perspective. And one of my concerns is if we start to decriminalize psychedelics, and I'm not opposed to that, but if we do, I want to make sure that we're not creating a society where people are chasing that feeling through the use of psychedelics. So there's been a lot of literature that suggests that psychedelic substances are not themselves addictive in the way that other like opioids are. So people don't become sort of chemically addicted to them. But I've heard anecdotally a lot of people talking about communities or individuals who are just using psychedelics all the time. And when I've talked to them about it, what they describe it as is like it's a dependence on the feeling. They're chasing the feeling. And it's because they're using them in ways that aren't really kind of, it's not sort of taking seriously what the substance can open for people. It's using it as the therapy itself. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do.
And so I don't know if that makes sense, but I think there is sort of the danger of the chase, right? Constantly chasing, well, I want to feel connected. And the only way I can feel connected is to be on a psychedelic. And so I have to keep taking the psychedelics to feel connected, rather than this has taught me a new way that I can be, and how do I use the other tools in my toolkit in everyday life to sustain that feeling or to cultivate those lessons that I learned during that experience, right?
Yeah, I think we're more at risk in regarding what you're talking about with regard to marijuana than with the classic psychedelics, because people can and do, and I've treated them, smoke marijuana on a daily basis. Not only on a daily basis, there are those who get up in the morning and start smoking it. The issue with say, LSD and psilocybin is that the effect that they have on the neurotransmitters is such that if you take it 2 days in a row, the second day you're not going to have the effect. And the third day you're going to have even less effect because you just wear out your serotonin, according to the researchers. So it's not as sort of like heroin, where you get a less effect, but then you take more heroin, so you get the effect. Then you take more and more, and you keep taking more and more, and it's a class of addictive substance. But you can't take 3 times the amount of LSD after you've taken it and expect to get the response. You're just not going to get it. So there's sort of a safety built in there. But at the same time, I do know what you're talking about, that there are going to be people who are going to be chasing transcendence, right? Or chasing getting out of the situation that we're living in, which, as I think back on what we've said during this conversation today, it's not a rosy picture of the culture that we've created. It's a very challenging situation we've created for ourselves on a societal level. I went to the city council of the little city that I live in here on the Pacific Coast in Mendocino County in California, and I proposed that they create a a community morale commission to do research and to have town hall meetings and interview people on what can be done to raise the morale of the community. Because our little community, like little communities all over the country, is in a state of depression. You can see it when you walk down the street. There's like a vibration of downness rather than upbeatness. And it started pretty much with the recession in 2007 and 2008. And then the pandemic was like a 1-2 punch. And so many businesses and people went under economically that the whole area has a feeling of depression. And so I've wondered, that's why I asked you the question about, do you know of anything that's being done on the statewide or national level to deal with these issues that you and I are talking about? Because all of them, in one way or another, are under the umbrella of mental health. Everything we've said today, in one way or other, is affecting the mental health of the population. And I think we need really a coordinated effort to acknowledge it and do something about it. And that's why I come back to having a little bit of bit of optimism when you say that the Surgeon General is aware that it's a serious problem.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I tend to be an optimist, so I don't think it's all gloomy. I do think, that first of all, even the pandemic, I think that for many people, the pandemic really was an opportunity for them to, whether they wanted it or not, an opportunity to sort of reset what's important to them, what their values are. We've seen, a lot of changes with regard to more hybrid work environments and people sort of really saying like, I want to live near family. I want to, this is what's really important to me. Like I realized, life is short and, I keep putting off the things that I really want to do. And we're seeing more and more people now. I think I've seen a lot of people this year traveling saying, I didn't get to travel for so long. That's really important to me. I realized like I can't keep putting off what I want to do forever because there may not be an opportunity for it to come. So, and I do think I couldn't agree with you more. I think more community-wide efforts to address sort of mental health. I think one thing that people started to do during the pandemic is get outside more, which was fantastic, right? I think connecting to nature is really, really important for mental health. And that can be really difficult to do in the daily grind of going from your home building to your work building to back to your home building and, really not ever having an opportunity to just kind of be outside and remember that we're part of the sort of this larger ecosystem. So I love your idea of doing community events around this and to really sort of for communities to come together around our mental health issues and create ways, both in city planning, which I think can help, right? Creating sort of the green spaces that are necessary, creating the activities that get people together and get them outside and things like that, as well as more, potentially formal mechanisms of intervention with mental health. I think it could be really important. I think also workplaces can be another place, living communities as well as workplaces that can be another place. And I know like at our institution, there's been a lot of effort over the last several years to increase our resources available to our community of people who work at our institution regarding tracking your mental health, getting help for mental health issues, making sure that you're sort of paying attention to your mental health in ways that it doesn't sort of sneak up on you.
Our country, one of the founding principles was the separation of church and state. The college that you work at, Baylor, is known as a Christian school.
So let me just
accurate?
correct you right here. That is not accurate. No. So Baylor University is a Christian university, I believe, but it is not connected with Baylor College of Medicine. So I work at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. It is a freestanding health science university. It is not a religious institution.
So it's separate from the college in Waco. In fact, you're not even in the same city. You're in Houston, Texas.
That's right. Yeah.
What's the vibe in Houston, Texas post-pandemic? How's Houston doing?
I think we're doing okay. All cities have their issues, but we have the largest medical center in the world in Houston, Texas. And so we had a lot of activity going on during the pandemic, a lot of work that was being done, and, both good and bad. I think there was a lot of difficulties within the medical center. I mean, it was really, really challenging to have such a traumatic public health crisis right at our front doors. But it also brought the community together in really important ways. And everybody sort of had a common goal to help patients and to help families and to maintain health. And it really was inspiring to see how our community came together in the face of that.
Does Houston seem to be holding up economically post-pandemic?
I think it is. I think, there's certainly, just as you mentioned, you see stores that have gone out of business and that's always very sad to see. But then there's new stores that are popping up. And I think the economy seems to be, changing, but not going under. Yeah.
Just for a frame of reference, this little city that I'm in is approximately 7,500 people, 1,200 people representing perhaps 3,000 people eat out of the food bank every month,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
that's a big number.
Yeah.
That tells you something about what's going on. And
Yeah.
fortunately, we have an amazing food bank which is really feeding the 1,200 people. But it's a sign of just how serious our situation is.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that.
One of the most optimistic takeaways I have from our conversation is that I can tell that you are indeed an optimistic person, and given the high positions that you're in with regard to setting policy, I think it's a benefit for all of us to have you in the positions you're in. So I thank you for that and for the service that you're
Thank you.
doing. So,
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
same here. Thank you very much. And thank you
Okay.
all, gentle listeners, for being with us today on Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. I remind you that we broadcast a program at 9 o'clock every Tuesday morning. And of course, everything we do is open source, free of charge, archived on our website, Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. So until next time, this is Dr. Richard Lewis Miller reminding you that good health is worth fighting for, and it's essential for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
All right. What's gonna be? All right.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift